So today, what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is embellishing tones, sometimes also known as non-chord tones or non-harmonic tones. And basically, they get those latter two names because they are notes that do not fit into a vertical chord or harmony. And so we can identify them as being a little bit of a sore thumb, and they stick out. I like to think of these chords kind of like throwing salt on your dinner. It could make it amazing, but too much you might regret. So when you're writing, you probably want to be somewhat selective about when and how to use them. And we'll go through a bunch that have harmonic implications that are rhythmic, and harmonic implications that are really more melodic. And so we don't necessarily have a rhythmic component to them. So starting out are some of the simpler ones. Right here, what I've got is this NT that stands for a neighbor tone. I can write on the board. Neighbor tone. Okay. And so imagine you're at your house and you're baking and you realize you're out of sugar. You go next door to borrow a cup. You come right back to your house. So you go to your neighbor and then you come back. So basically, these notes are approached by step, and then they are left by step, but in the opposite direction of the approach. So here we're being approached kind of from the south to the north, right? And then we go back the other way. So ascending and then descending. Again, you could have it the opposite way. And then NG is usually what we use for neighbor group. Okay. And that just means that we've got multiple notes. Again, none of them fit into a chord. So oftentimes the neighbor group is a step above or below the other chord tones, but the group itself is going to have a little jump, usually of a third. You can have more than two notes as a neighbor group also, but most commonly you're just going to have a couple like this. Passing tones, very similar, okay, approached by step, but in this case, we're literally passing through. So we're leaving by step in the same direction. So you're on a road trip, and you come to a town that you want to go to a restaurant or antique shopping or something, make it up, right? And then you keep on going on your trip, right? You pass through that town. So passing tones do the same thing. And again, you can have more than one passing tone at a time, okay? Just notice that here we do not have any leaps. Okay, because in this case, we're going from maybe an inverted chord of some kind, right? Where we've got a chord tone to begin with and a chord tone we're ending on, but then the two steps in between do not belong. And so we end up with a passing tone kind of, we don't really call them a passing group, but multiple passing tones at once. Okay. Both of these are kind of what we consider melodic non-chord tones. And basically that means that they can happen on any beat. And most commonly, we have them between the beats. So our chords are on the beat, and then connecting the chords, we'll have a passing tone or a neighbor tone. And that's called unaccented. So you can have an unaccented neighbor or passing tone, and then you can have an accented neighbor or passing tone that actually does happen on the beat. Okay. Moving down our little list here, we've got pedal tones. Sometimes it's called pedal points, okay? And we abbreviate that PED. We came across this in our 6/4 chords, right? We had a pedal 6/4. It was basically a one chord going to a 4/6/4, back to a one, and that bass note just kind of kept going and staying the same. So sometimes what happens with those pedal notes is that they remain, but the chord above, isn't their friend. And so it doesn't fit nicely. So that pedal point then becomes the non-chord tone for that beat, but then we'll come back to the pedal tone. So for example, this is also a pedal tone. Okay. The notes that fit, but these are not marked because they are part of the chord. All right. So this pedal specifically here is the non-chord tone. That's where it is that thing that just doesn't belong. Okay. Also can be accented or unaccented. Usually pedal tones are both actually, because they kind of just remain, right? So in this case, all of our non-chord tone pedal points are going to be unaccented, because here we are on the second half of our measure. So if we imagine, we don't have a meter, but if we imagine maybe we're in 2/2, right? This is the strong beat and this is the weak beat. And so the pedal comes on the weak beat. That would be an unaccented beat. Of course, it would be different if we had a different meter. So got to watch out for that. The next one is an anticipation. Anticipation. And the anticipation is something that we hear very often at a cadence in Baroque music. So if you jump over here to the cadence, you have E and then trill, bum, bum, right? That anticipation is the note that gets to the resolution just a little bit too soon, okay? And so if you look at some of these other examples here, ba-dum, bum, right? Basically, they are all variations on the same theme, either ascending or descending, and note that they can be approached by a leap, not necessarily just by step, okay? And they are rhythmic, right? They have a rhythmical component. So the non-harmonic functioning here has to also have a rhythmical aspect to it. So they always come in, rhythmically speaking, they always come in early, right? And so they are kind of anticipating the resolution of wherever we're going. Suspension. Suspensions are a slightly more complicated non-chord tone, abbreviated with SUS, and they come in different varieties that are identified by their intervallic structure, okay? So let's talk about the logistics first. So suspension is going to be a non-harmonic tone on a strong beat. So maybe here we're in 4/4, okay? And so 3, the third beat in each of these measures, okay, is going to be considered the strong beat, right? So it's on the beat. We are preparing suspensions, okay? So you always have a preparation to a suspension that comes from a previous beat. It does not have to be a strong beat. In this case, all of ours are strong beats, but we have a preparation that is the same note, okay? So they pretty much are approached by the same note, right? They're prepared. We have the suspended note, which is, again, kind of a rhythmical issue. We're actually delaying the melodic process for that suspended note, okay? For the prepared note. The chord underneath or above, the chord otherwise changes and creates kind of a crunch that the suspended note is the culprit of. It's not part of the chord there. That's our non-chord tone. And this is very important. We always have a resolution that steps down. Okay. So we always prepare by the same pitch. We suspend into a strong beat, and then we have a resolution that steps down. We prepare. And notice this is a dotted rhythm, okay? Prepare into a strong beat and then steps down into our resolution. Now, let's talk about the first 3, and then we'll look at this, the 2/3 at the end here. So the first 3 suspensions that we have are 9/8, 7/6, and a 4/3. So these would be indicated in your figured bass if you have any suspensions in any of your part writing exercises. The issue is that the figures always indicate the interval above the bass note, right? And because these suspensions are very specific intervals, they always go into those figures. So the way we count this is that we are looking at the lowest note, right, which is our bass note. In this case, they're all on one staff, but of course you can have them on a grand staff. So you're looking at the bass note up to the actual suspended note. So in this case, we have a 9, right? A 9th that is stepping down to an octave. So this is called a 9/8 suspension. It's a little less, it's prominent and they are used, and you should know what a 9/8 suspension is, but they're a little bit less impactful because the note of resolution, which is the C in this case, is actually being is actually sounded with the suspension. So it's still a crunch. It's still a moment, a seasoning moment, to use my food analogy again, that we'll notice. But then as we step down out of that, you're actually going to be playing a note that's already sounding, right? So the resolution is maybe a little bit less sweet than some of these other resolutions. So a 7/6, again, we're looking at the bass note. So we're looking at the E going up to the D, and then we step down into the 6, the E up to the C. Okay, so that's the 7 and the 6. And then here, our suspended note is actually this dotted note here, right? So that's an F. So C up to F is our 4, and then C up to E is our 3rd. And again, all of this numerically is going to be reduced within an octave, with the exception of the 9th. Occasionally you'll see a written 2/1, but very rarely. That's kind of an older notation. I think 9/8 is much more prevalent. Now, okay, the suspension here, if you've noticed, all of these other suspensions go from a big number to a smaller number, okay, and they're all stepping, so it's just numerically they're going down. The 2/3 suspension is the bass suspension. It is possible to have a bass suspension, okay, and it works exactly the same way. We've got a preparation, that's our D. The suspension is the actual D here, and then our resolution steps down. Remember, I said it's a very specific pattern, always stepping down. So the C steps down. What we have then is a measurement from the bass up to our other notes in the chord, and the step down is then going to be bigger. It's going to make that interval wider if we're thinking about stepping in the bass. Okay, now you can measure it any way you want, but bass suspensions are always a 2/3 suspension. Okay, so in this case, we're measuring to, I guess, what the tenor note is, right? It's all in one step. So it would be the D up to the E is a 2, and then the C to the E is then a 3. So those are suspensions. The last couple, suspension, I guess I should say pedal up here because I didn't write that in, pedal tone. Okay. All right. So moving right along to these last couple that we have here. This is an escape tone. An escape tone is, you can kind of think of it like the opposite of a suspension, okay, in terms of motion. Instead of, sometimes they can be prepared. It's really a retardation if it's prepared, which we'll talk about in a minute. But let me see if I can scroll here, because I'm going to need to move the page and I might lose my, yeah, that's okay. Okay, let me clear the writing. There we go. So we could talk about retardation, because that really is kind of what follows suspension here. So a retardation is, like I said, melodically kind of the opposite of a suspension. So down here, we have a preparation note, which is the same note as the retardation, right? And then we have a stepwise resolution, but the resolution goes up instead of down. Okay, so we're still looking for a strong beat, a prepared note into a strong beat. There's still that rhythmical element there, but then our step up is actually the resolution note. Same thing here. We've got a preparation, the retardation itself, and then the step up for the resolution. Preparation as a dotted note, right? And so it would be there, and then step up into the resolution. And the thing about this is that retardations don't generally take a numeric, number label, right? Numeric label. So we could just say retardation. We don't have to say, an 8/9 or whatever we have, or I guess it would be like a 7/8, or something like that. We don't have to do that. By the way, suspensions, because that first number has to be a non-chord tone, we are not going to have a 6/5 suspension. That doesn't really exist. Okay. It's not just the non-chord tone. It is that first note. If you remember back to your counterpoint days, that first note is actually the dissonance. Okay, so the non-chord tone here has to be a good dissonance. So we're not going to have 6/5. And again, retardation, we don't actually label the interval. So we could have it theoretically, you know, on any note that just does not fit the chord. Okay. Okay, now let's go back. Escape tone and appoggiatura. These two are kind of opposites. So where the suspension and retardation were opposites, the escape tone and the appoggiatura kind of go together the same way. Let's talk about appoggiatura first and then escape tone, because I think appoggiatura is a little bit more prevalent. So appoggiatura is where you leap into the dissonance, okay, and then step out of the dissonance in the opposite direction. So in the first example, we have a leap up and then a step down, and that's very, very, very common. You could have it the other way around, which is a leap down and then a step up. Typically, appoggiaturas happen on strong beats, okay? But that's not 100% of the time. There are many times where appoggiaturas don't happen on strong beats. They happen in between the beats. They are just a little less effective, I think, that way. But we don't necessarily have a very strict rhythmical component here like we do for suspension. Appoggiaturas are possible in between beats, but most common and most effective whenever we have them on the beat. Escape tones, similar, okay? So the escape tone is where you're taking the leaping pattern of the appoggiatura and you're reversing it. So you step up, leap down, or step down and leap up. Okay. And the step is a step into the dissonance when then you're leaping away from the dissonance. Appoggiaturas tend to be, like I said, a little bit more effective when they're on the beat. But in general, I think appoggiaturas are even more effective than escape tones. And for escape tones, we do not have any rhythmical component. They could be on or between strong beats. So one way that you can kind of keep these straight is that the appoggiatura is a leap up and a step down. Appoggiatura means to lean. So literally it's like you're jumping onto the note that you need to lean on. And then you kind of, step away from that. Okay. So you jump to the lean and step away. Escape tone. I had a student many years ago that he said the way that he remembered escape tone was like a prisoner trying to escape from his cell or from the prison. He would step up onto the wall and then leap off the wall. So if you can remember that, picture that little analogy there, the escape tone steps and then leaps away to escape versus the appoggiatura, which means to lean on the note that you're jumping to. So hopefully that's helpful. That is non-chord tones in a nutshell. Again, sometimes called non-harmonic tones or embellishing tones.
Okay, today in this video, we're going to be discussing diminished chords and specifically what on earth to do with diminished chords when we have them in a progression where we have to resolve the kind of tense dissonant harmony that comes with a diminished chord. Remember that diminished chord, actually the root and the fifth are the ones that are the unstable elements. And so in your diminished harmony, you're actually going to want to double the third. It's one of the few times where we really have to double the third of the triad, so that we're not accidentally doubling another note that is going to be a tendency tone and need to resolve in a particular pattern. So we have two examples here in E minor, and I just want to walk through both of them and talk about where the placement of the different notes are, each chord member is. So we've got our one chord to start us off, right? E, G, and B. We've doubled the E because we're in a root position triad. That makes our spacing fairly open, but not ridiculous. We still have much less than an octave between contiguous voices, and so that'll give us some room to work with. The 7 diminished 6. Notice that it is a diminished chord in minor, but basically that means we have to add the leading tone in, okay? Because that's, not going to be a diatonic pitch. So we go ahead and put the F sharp in the bass and the F sharp in the tenor. So remember, our chord tones are going to be D sharp, F sharp, and A.
right? That makes up our diminished triad. We're going to double the third. So we're doubling our F sharp here. Up above is where the leading tone comes in. That's the root of the chord. And then the A is up above that. Notice that we have fifths here, but they are not even. Okay, they're not considered parallel because we're actually going from a perfect fifth to a diminished fifth. Okay, same thing when we resolve. So what we have in the next chord here can kind of go a couple of different ways, actually. We're going to a 1-6. Notice that the 7, because it's not in root position, we're not going directly to a 1. Okay, so if you find that in your writing, go back and double check what you've done, because really our 7 should always be in a first inversion, and then that means that we're not going to go to a root position chord. So, or root position tonic anyway. Here, the very first thing that we have to do is we have to resolve our leading tone, right? So the D sharp goes up, okay, up to E. We know that the bass has to be G because we're in the first inversion of this triad. So now we have some decisions to make on where everything else goes. We could maybe consider doing 2 Gs in the bass. Or sorry, not bass, but the bass in the tenor. That would be okay. A lot of times that's not really considered parallel octaves, but it is parallel unisons, which, we like to avoid that stuff if we can. So we're going to instead go ahead and leap up to the B. It is a fourth, but it is a perfect fourth. And so we're not, concerned necessarily with the span of that particular leap. And it does keep our voices, separated. So tenor can go into the B, that's fine. The A, because the A is part of this tritone here, what would be optimal is maybe to bring it down to the G here. Okay, so that tritone can actually resolve inward. So whatever direction your leading tone goes, the other side of that tritone really wants to go the opposite direction. That would be fine. And we can double the third of a 1-6 chord. That's not really going to be a problem. If you really felt like you needed to double the root, unfortunately, you're going to run into a little bit more trouble because we have a leap here, A to E would take us quite far. And I'm not sure that we really want to go up that far. It would be it depending on where you were in your voicing, maybe you could deal with that. But the fact that we actually have this here I'm still erasing, aren't I? Sorry. There we go. To the G, that's really the most optimal resolution pattern that we have there. And just for clarity, I'm going to erase this down here. There we go. All right, so that's that. Moving on to the next couple of chords here. This is a kind of a slightly different pattern. We are still in E minor, so remember that the 2 chord in minor is a diminished chord diatonically. So what we have is our 1-6 that then is going to a 2 diminished 6 chord. So in E minor, obviously that's going to be F sharp, and I'll do it down here. So F sharp, A, and C natural. We've put the A in the bass and then doubled that note up in the soprano. Okay, so this time our doubling is actually in 2 different voices in space, right? Not necessarily on the same staff like we had in the previous example. So we've got A and A, F sharp and C are in the middle. And it might look a little bit like, this middle line's a little close. We do have a unison here to start with. So immediately we've separated that out by going in, opposite directions. Okay, so contrary motion there. So our tritone here is between the F sharp and the C. Now, what we have is kind of an indirect type of resolution, okay, because we're going to a 5-7. We're not just going to a tonic. So the 5-7 is in root position. That's a B chord, right? B, D sharp, F sharp, and A. We keep the common tone A. We keep the common tone F sharp. the bass takes care of itself. So the only place we really can go with the tenor is up to the D sharp. And then we move here, to resolve it afterward. There's one problem with this, and you might be tempted to do this on your part writing exam, but I wanted to point this out. This looks great, right? I mean, just to look at it, at first glance, it doesn't look like there's really any problems. However, and I'm following all of our rules, right? Which is to keep the common tones. However, if you look carefully, this interval is a problem. Okay, that is actually our augmented second interval. And yes, it does happen. I know there are plenty of examples in Bach, but what we want to do is avoid augmented intervals if we can in our part writing. And so what I am going to do is actually revoice this chord, because we have to eliminate that augmented second. I can't do anything about the bass, but I am going to see if there's a way that we can kind of, get around that, that particular chord. And then that might change our resolution pattern here too. Okay, so let's take a peek at this, and I'll do this in green so that it looks a little bit different from what's already up there. So we know we need a D sharp, we need an F sharp, and we need an A. If I wanted to put the D sharp in the soprano, my problem there would be A to D sharp being a tritone. And that's also a forbidden interval melodically. So can't go in the soprano, can't go in the tenor. So guess what? I'm stuck a little bit. We are going to have to put it in the alto. Okay, that's really the only place that this can go right now. We've got an A, and then we've got an F sharp. Well, the A, again, it would be easy to say, all right, let's just stick to the common tone, right? Because we're used to doing that. But again, if I do F sharp, I've got a tritone here. So we have a lot of intervallic issues with this one. So what we're going to have to do, and which is really the only thing we can do, is we're going to have to put the F sharp in the soprano and move by thirds. Okay. Technically speaking, this is not a voice crossing or voice overlap, because it just comes to the same note. So we're okay there. And then we're going to have to come down to A here. Okay, it's really the only thing we can do to avoid any of those augmented intervals. Now, let's take a peek and see what we have here with our resolution. So we have to move the bass. And remember that there is a rule with root position 5/7 chord that's being resolved to a resolution tonic chord. It's going to be an incomplete resolution so that we can avoid all the parallel fifths. And let me get another color. We have them right in front of us. So here's a fifth, right? A to E, and here's a fifth, B to E. So we're going to have to redo what was given to us here and see if we can resolve some of this correctly. So what we have is an E there that we know has to go there. And then we've got the G and the B. We need to resolve some things in the upper voice. Okay. We know that our leading tone has to go up. We know that our chordal seventh, the A, has to come down. So E, G, E. If we went up to B here, we would again have parallel fifths. We would have them between the soprano and the bass. Obviously not a good thing, right? So we can't go to B. Generally speaking, the acceptable resolution is to triple the root. So just remember, in root position 5/7, going to a root position tonic, major or minor, you will need to triple the root in the tonic and make it an incomplete triad, which is fine to do, in order to avoid all the parallels whenever you're doing any kind of resolution pattern that way. There is one other option that I wanted to bring up, and that is basically to have an incomplete dominant chord. So let me do this in a different color here. So I'm going to do a pink color. So we've got our B, right? And In making an incomplete root position 5/7 chord, basically the note we're going to leave out is this F sharp. Okay. It's the only note we can leave out. We can't leave out the leading tone. We can't leave out the chordal seventh. We can't leave out the bass. So we've got a bass note. And if we can, we'll just double, since we have 4 voices, we'll see if we can double the bass, because that, again, is the only note that isn't a tendency tone. We need to have the D sharp, and we've gone over this already, that we can only really have it in this alto voice here. We need to have an F sharp, and again, unfortunately, the F is only going to be available in the soprano because we can't leap to it from a C in the tenor. So what we're going to do in the tenor is we're simply going to step down. Now, if I'm resolving this to the next chord, okay, my E comes up because I have to resolve the bass the way that the Roman numerals tell me to do it. The E comes to, oh, sorry, wait a minute. let me undo this. Let me undo this. I jumped ahead too far. Okay. We don't want the F sharp. Sorry. We do want the A. We want to keep the A. I thought that looked a little weird to me. Okay. Let me get back to this here. We've got the F sharp. Oops. Why is it still erasing? Okay. We've got the F sharp. Or sorry, we get the D sharp. Okay. And that was our previous resolution. Now we're in business. I thought that looked a little weird. Okay. So we do need to keep the A, right? We don't have the F sharp though. That one is going to be, yeah, we can do this. So we can keep the common tone. Okay. Now we can resolve it. Now I caught myself. Okay. So we do resolve the leading tone up, and then of course the chordal seventh has to come down. Okay, there we go. Now that we have a chordal seventh, it can resolve down. Now, since we've got all these things resolved, we can simply keep the common tone B. So in that case, this pink resolution here is where we have an incomplete 5/7 going to a complete tonic. It's not, I think, maybe as common as, you know, a complete dominant chord and then an incomplete resolution. It is equally effective though. And if you remember all your chord tones, is just as, you know, is valid basically as going the other way. It takes care of all of the parallels and makes a nice smooth melodic line. And you do actually get to do more with stepwise motion and keeping your common tone. So if that's what you're after, then the 5/7 being incomplete is totally fine. Again, coming from this diminished 2, we have a lot to consider in terms of the intervallic structures of that 5/7, you know, which notes are going to be in which voices, because we want to try to avoid all augmented melodic intervals.